welcome back to this conversation. My name is Moises Naim. I'm a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, and I'll be delighted to chair and guide the conversation this afternoon with this splendid panel that the Bertelsmann Foundation has assembled to discuss a very important theme, which is coupling or decoupling, and what is the role of fast-growing poor countries in propelling their recovery or not, and how are they connected amongst them, and how they are connected to the larger global economy. As I said, we have a splendid panel. Sri Mulyani is the former Minister of Planning of Indonesia, and now she is the Managing Director at the World Bank. Welcome. And Krueger used to be the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and now is a professor at SAIS at Johns Hopkins. She's, of course, well known as the author of very important seminal works. Welcome, Anne. Ian Bremmer is another very prolific author, well known. Recently wrote a book called Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. His concept of a G0 world is a world where there's no group of 8, group of 20, or group of anything, but a world where power is hard to wield. Welcome, Ian. And Deven Sharma is the former president of Standard & Poor. He also has a PhD in economics and a strong perspective about markets and their dynamics. So let me start with you, Sri. Coupling and decoupling. It used to be that was a main, when the crisis started, that was a main puzzle. Will poor countries drag down the economy, or were fast-growing poor countries going to be the solution? Mm-hmm. Were they going to decouple from the larger G7, G20, G7 economies, mm-hmm. and the rich countries' economies that were stagnating and crashing, and become the engine of the world economy, or were they going to be a problem? What do we know now?
Well, the phenomena in 2010, in which many of the emerging countries, middle-income countries, really growing very well or rebound from 2009 recession, give the impression that there is a decoupling in a way that many of these emerging middle-income countries can grow very fast when the advanced country, OECD country, or European, United States, Japan, is struggling still with the prolonged recession. I think we should look at the policy side. Since 2009, there are quite a lot of very coordinated and forceful counter-cyclical policy. And many of these middle-income countries still have a space, fiscal space, to do this counter-cyclical policy, both through the fiscal expansion, or on the monetary side, they are declining or loosening their monetary policy. So that worked well, and that make what you call it play, replacing what the external demand coming from the United States and European. But if you look at the much more long term, I mean, Asia, especially if you look at the China, I mean, their export is actually the source of growth. We know that the 30 years of China growth, which is more than 10%, was really driven by the investment export-driven growth. So there is no way now the question is, can other emerging countries replace the role of United States and Europe to become the final demand of the Chinese product? I think in this case it cannot substitute fully at this stage. And that's why you see now the weakening growth of China is because the external demand weakening coming from Europe as well as United States now is already entering into their growth situation or growth performance. Their counter-cyclical is also has already now declined. They may still have a fiscal space to do the counter-cyclical, but I guess if you look at the second theme in which you talk about balance and balanced global growth in this case, it is really more the counter-cyclical that they have to direct their spending not to boost again the investment and export-led, but should be more on a consumption, domestic consumption. And that will take longer time because it will require quite a lot of institutional setting, policy setting, or framework that need to be adjusted quite dramatically in China.
Before we move on very quickly, let me ask you about how worried should we be about the slowing down of China that you mentioned? And your bank, the World Bank, just issued a major report about China, essentially saying that it cannot go on, it won't go on unless major reforms are undertaken. That was echoed by Wen Jiabao speaking at the Assembly, at the General. So how worried, and they have already reduced their estimate for growth. So how permanent is this slowdown?
Well, the leader there is recognized that their growth model in the past 30 years cannot serve in the next 30 years if they want to maintain. We also recognize that 10% may be no longer sustainable. If they can reach this more than 10%, not only because the investment-driven, export-driven growth, but also because the urbanization, which is really creating very high, and they come from a low base. So if you talk about medium-term projection, it's going to be lower than 10%. So if you talk about the new normal, you're talking about 7, 8 in this case. Or then they're talking about that changing their growth model, which is more on a domestic base. And that's quite a lot of discussion regarding their fiscal aspect, because it will change quite a lot in terms of the way they provide basic services to the people, so that they can unleash their consumption by providing health services, pension fund, pension services, as well as the education. And that is something which will very, very different from the way they have to manage their economy. The second actor, which is very important, is state-owned enterprises in this case. We know that in this case, the distortion of price, especially on a capital which is relatively cheap in China, that make all the incentive to go to the manufacturing investment activity. If you are going to go to more on a consumption-driven, the relative price between labor, that is wage, and capital, which is very cheap because of the intervention, need to be corrected. And that means quite a lot of reform on the financial sector and financial policy.
And that really hurts in an economy that needs the state to actually function. So I clearly think that well beyond China, the level of risk around Russia as we go medium, long term is really great.
Thank you, Ian. That's very interesting. I'll get back to some follow-up questions on that. Deven Sharma, the Chinese Vice Premier Wang Qishan said that an unbalanced recovery would be better than a balanced recession. And you think it's going to be unbalanced, right?
The fact is, every country is very different in its competitiveness. It's in the wage flexibility, the labor flexibility, the wage rates, and it's in competitiveness. It's fiscal policy, it's monetary policy. So by definition, it will be uneven recovery, and different countries will move in different directions in different ways. But more importantly, it's really, I want to pick up Anne's this finding from the World Bank study. It's a very interesting insight for me, because it basically says for 46 years the forecast didn't turn out to be right. So then you ask the question, why? And there really one or two things out of that make a difference. And Ian, that where I may disagree with you is it's about leadership and it's about politics. And even as you look at across the countries, across the world, everything is driven by domestic politics. Yes, you need a global architecture to coordinate policies, and whether it's the IMF or other global institutions can influence that, but a lot of it is driven by domestic politics. Whether it's in US or it's in Europe or whether it's in China, China knows where they have to move, what they have to do in terms of currency, in terms of interest rates, in terms of creating safety nets and trying to drive domestic consumption, but they have to move it at a pace that they can keep stability in the country. So it's really about domestic politics that really drives and influences. And so as a result, the recovery will be uneven and it'll be an unbalanced recovery.
Is there something one can do? Is there something the world can do, the IMF, the World Bank, Boy Scouts, anyone? Is there anything? Because the options are, either an imbalanced recovery or a balanced recession. What about a balanced recovery? How can one work for that?
Yeah. Look, let me pick up from a very micro level. You look at, there was so much focus on financial regulation that it must be coordinated, it must be consistent across the world. And to some extent it is. But however, there is a lot of differences that have also cropped up across the world around financial regulations. So you ask the question, wait a minute, everybody got around the room, central bankers, FSB, and everybody had the right intent, the right smartness, but why did it turn out to be different? And it's really driven by every country has a different, they're in a different stage of growth. They have different attitudes towards savings, different culture towards spending, and different acceptance of deficit levels, different behaviors, different judicial systems, so and different domestic politics.
Can I comment this?
Of course.
Well, I mean, the choice between unbalanced recession and unbalanced recovery and balanced recession, I think the worry is because we know what to do to create the more balanced and sustainable growth globally. That is, from the United States and Europe, you have to save more, you then have to export, and somebody else have to buy that goods, and that means the Asia or emerging country have to do more domestic consumption. So this policy coordination, technically, I think everybody can recognize that. The problem when you really work with the policy, I mean, the speed of this policy adjustment at the macro level usually is much faster. Monetary policy can be weekly, you change, or monthly. Fiscal policy usually based on the fiscal year, so yearly. But the adjustment cannot just change the magnitude, whether you are going to loosening the monetary policy or expanding your fiscal deficit, but really change whether shifting from the export investment-driven into consumption-driven in China can really support it by their institutional change. The wage policy need to be changed, and that will touch the labor market, and that will be very political then. Yeah. If you're talking about the consumption-driven, the hukou system, which is very much tied with the city system there, municipality, need to be more portable. And that will touch the issue about services for the citizen. And that's also another political and institutional change. So the speed of institutional and policy change, which is related to this shifting the demand to the domestic, is not going to be as fast as the monetary policy that will stimulate or counter-cyclical growth. And that is more the worry for many of policymakers, that your choice is not between balanced growth or unbalanced growth, but it's between what you call it, the recovery, which is maybe rather unbalanced because the speed of this policy adjustment cannot be harmonized, with a more, if you are going to get it, it will be balanced, but then all going down to the recession. So I think that is more or less the message which is coming. So you are asking about what could we do. I mean, back in 2009, when we have all this threat of global recession or depression in a way, all the political leaders in the G20, I remember in London, Gordon Brown and all the G20 leaders said that, well, we are really faced with this threatening global meltdown. So there can be very much easy to come to one convergence policy agreement and reaction, and then they just doing it because the threat is really imminent. The situation now is different, and then also if you combine with that option of policy, that require a different direction of policy, and that makes what you call it, the question earlier about whether the situation is more unstable. It is become unstable because it require a different policy reaction. The speed is different, and then you then match with this political, social, institutional, it will create all this complexity.
Sri, do you agree with Ian that Russia is the one large emerging market that is more prone to instability or has the highest risk of becoming unstable?
Well, as an economist, I'm not a political scientist in this case. As an economist, you look at a bit more on the magnitude, of course. I mean, of course, the biggest economy is United States. Anything happen to United States, it will affect the whole global economy. That's Lehman problem is also affecting all remote country which is innocent is affected by all this Lehman problem. The second largest now China, and anything happen to China is definitely is going to affect. So I think as an economist, I will try to follow that discipline. I mean, Russia is there in a G20, but maybe in terms of size, maybe if they are going to change, it will be affected their own or maybe all countries surrounding it.
To put it more bluntly, what's happening with Russia is that it's becoming less systemic. It's becoming a petrostate. So it's oil and not much more.
Yes.
And therefore, its instability there.
It's not connected with, except
so
maybe some country which is
You have a
surrounding
more
them.
polite way of saying it. But
Well, I'm an economist, should be a little bit polite maybe.
I think the answer was yes, though. I think I heard yes.
You wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to pick up on her comment. But and if you look at China, everybody knows savings need to get intermediated into some form of investment so that, citizens, because there's no safety net, so they can sort of have some retirement support for themselves. But to change customer or individual behaviors, to take the savings and to invest in something, first to create the institution for investment, then for individuals to change, this is a long-term process. So by definition, recovery cannot be in the same speed.
Interesting. Thanks, Ian. So a good conversation is the one you don't want it to end. And it is also one that has ideas that linger, and that a few weeks from now you're going to be driving or doing something else, and some ideas that we tossed around here will come back. And so we had a great conversation, but unfortunately we need to end, despite the fact that I'm sure that we wanted more of it. Please join me in thanking Sri Mulyani, Anne Krueger, Ian Bremmer, and Deven Sharma.